Hello there, this is Ildy Morris, a learning design consultant, and in this session I'm going to describe how problem components work on the edX platform. Problem components are otherwise known as the assessments. So to get started, there's going to be sort of a quick overview of the different kinds of problem components. They're broken down in the platform between basic and advanced. I'm also going to describe the grading policy, also the role of content libraries, and interspersed through all this, I'm going to be talking about how you go in and actually edit the problem components. So the first thing to think about is, what are even the reasons for making changes to the assessments? Well, if you are a facilitator who's going to be running a course that is perhaps a little older or might have some out-of-date content, you might need to go in and correct any questions or answers that are wrong. Maybe learners have given feedback and said that they were misleading or confusing or based upon information that just isn't accurate at the time. Also, sometimes content does get changed in the course, so as a result, the related assessments need to get changed too. So you might need to update them just to make sure that they do align with the content. The course team might ask you to add new assessments, but again, all and any of this kind of content change should be done with a lot of communication with the course team. And then the main thing to remember is it really is not recommended at all to change any of the assessments once a course has started. There's a lot of reasons for that. The first one is, the question of like parity across learners and how they're evaluated. So if the set of learners that came in and answered a question that was perhaps easy and got it right and achieved a certain score in the course, if you were to compare them to the next set of learners that came in and answered that same question that was made to be much more difficult and didn't get that question right, and that affected their score, that doesn't necessarily align with the sense of academic integrity that a lot of course teams want to maintain. So again, unless it is something critically wrong or urgent, just double check that the course team really actually wants you to make a change to any assessment once the course has begun. So I mentioned that assessments are broken down into two categories. So again, you would access this area by going into Studio, navigating down to the unit and finding the problem components. And you could, potentially add a problem component, or you would need to go in and edit. In terms of the choices of the problem components, when it comes time to actually add them, there are basically these two lists: the common problem types and the advanced. As you can see, for the common problem types, there are essentially these top ones here, about 6 of them, but they also have the ability to add hints and feedback. What's nice about these components is that they all come with templatized content. So they're pre-populated with like a sample question and instructions on how to make a change. So for you to go in and actually add a new assessment, if you just follow the instructions within that problem component, it should be pretty straightforward and pretty easy to follow in terms of how to do that. What can get a little trickier are the specific settings associated with the problem components. So for example, course teams can determine how many attempts a learner has to get the question right. So for ungraded, purely check for understanding types of questions, it's very common to just leave this blank, because blank means infinite attempts are allowed. However, for a graded assessment, particularly one where credit or certificate is involved, course teams are very likely to limit the number of attempts to be 1, 2, possibly 3, depending upon their leniency and the difficulty of the question. So this is definitely something that you should work with the course team to clearly understand what are the requirements around the maximum attempts for ungraded and graded assessment questions. The next question to find out, and again, this is only if you have to go in and add or make changes to questions, is how much that problem component is going to be worth. So if you leave this blank, the default is going to be 1 point, as it says here. And that's very common. I would say the majority of the questions on the edX platform are left blank and are worth 1 point. However, sometimes there are questions that are more complex, more involved. Perhaps it's a multiple choice question that's very long. Just perhaps the content is trickier. In that case, a lot of course teams will suggest to raise the problem weight to be more than 1, to be 2, 3, 4, 5 points, whatever they think it is. The platform will automatically calculate and add up all of the questions and the number that learners get right, and they will sort of do the math. So you don't really have to worry too much about how it all gets calculated. You just need to confirm how much they want that particular problem to be weighted overall. You can skip over the randomization. That isn't really used very much anymore. And then the other option that may come up is when to actually show the answer to the learner. So again, I would get guidance from the course team on this. Some course teams are of the philosophy of, eventually you should always show the answer because learners will, learn from their mistakes. However, if it's a graded assessment and it's a higher stakes assessment, you probably don't want to have the answer shown because that would make it easier for learners, unfortunately, to be dishonest and maybe share their correct answers with other learners in the course. So fortunately, it's pretty unlikely that that will happen, and it doesn't happen very often, but it's just something to keep in mind that for high stakes exams, it's a good idea to not show the answer. Okay, the second category is the advanced assessments. So again, if you were clicking on the new problem component, you would just click on this tab up here. You notice there's far fewer advanced assessments. And honestly, some of these are used quite often. I would say the drag and drop is used a fair amount, and the open response assessment, otherwise known as the peer assessment, is also used a fair amount. The others, not so much. They're really for more technical or math and science oriented kinds of courses. The third way to add assessments to a course. So the majority of them are going to be basic. Some next small percentage are going to be advanced, and then there's going to be a very small percentage, very few advanced assessments that have to be turned on, so to speak, in the platform in order to show up. So this is something the course team will typically do when the course is being built, so you don't have to worry about that so much. But just so you're aware, when that does happen, that advanced features are turned on in the advanced settings part of Studio in a course, those features then become available by clicking on this advanced button in this menu bar. So again, this is pretty much an edge case. It doesn't happen very often, but if you do see that advanced button, and if you are, sort of curious what is there, how it showed up, and if you need to add an assessment or a component type that's in the advanced section, that is how you would do it. I'm going to also now talk about course teams that might use content libraries for their assessments. So the background of this and the reason that they might want to do this is, again, for really more high stakes exams or for convenience. So the way content libraries work is they're really like a standalone library that can be linked to one or more courses in the platform. So the idea here is, let's say you're running several versions of like an algebra class, but you find as a course author that the exam questions are really very similar, very much the same. So instead of building, repetitive exams in each of your algebra courses, you can build one library of algebra assessment questions, keep it separate, and then essentially link directly to that library of algebra questions in an exam within a course. So course teams who use this feature, they will be the ones who will build the content library, maintain it, and they'll be the ones that will essentially set up that configuration to link to it in the course. That's very typical. They may ask you, if they are using this feature, to actually go in and make changes or updates to assessment questions that reside in the content library. So from a user experience perspective, it's really very, very similar to just going into the course and making a change to a problem component. What you would do is, from the studio home, you would have to be added to the library itself, and you would access it from this top level here. It would be right next to your courses. The way that the button would even appear, I mentioned before advanced settings, is again, the course team would need to add library content in the advanced settings. And so then this library feature would become an option in that menu bar under the advanced button. As I mentioned, you would need to be enrolled in the library to have access to it, but to actually go in and make changes to the problem components, you would go into the library much like you would a course and make your edits and changes and save them. So the process is very similar in terms of updating the actual problem component. It's just sort of where it lives, and how it gets into the course is somewhat different. And last but not least, I want to describe the grading policy. So again, you will probably not have to worry about changing this. If for some reason you are asked to change it, you would go into the grading section within Studio, and this is literally just a slider that you can drag. So 50 is pretty low. Course teams typically have a pass-fail number of 70 or 80. That's a little more common. Maybe higher if if there's credit or higher stakes testing involved. And what's important about this is a learner will not be able to earn a certificate until they have passed this threshold of here, 50, for example. So that is just something to be aware of. If you are asked to change it, again, just confirm with the course team, what that number is, and you can change the grading and the cutoff for the certificate in this location. The other thing with the grading policy, and again, this really should be set up in the course in advance, but there might be some adjustments made to it, is the way that the assignments are even made to be graded is in the grading policy. Once you've set the threshold, you then have the option to create assessment types, otherwise known as assignment types. So you can have assignments that are labeled homework, or you can have them labeled a quiz or a test or a midterm or a final. It's totally up to the course team how they want to label it. So really the way that course teams will put this together is they'll often have, a few quizzes that lead up to some kind of a final assessment. And they will determine how many quizzes they're gonna have, or even homework assignments. So in this example, this course team has decided to have assessment types that they've labeled homework. This is just an abbreviation that shows up in the chart for learners, so you don't have to worry too much about that. And then the other thing that the course team has set up is how much of the total grade does the homework count, and they've said it's worth 15% of the total grade. By the way, the total grade needs to equal 100. So that's another good thing to check when you're looking over a course before it goes live, is to make sure all these assignment types ultimately add up to 100. It's very easy for course teams to go in, tweak some of the assignment types and the weights, and forget to adjust the total to make sure that they do. In this example too, this course team has specified that there's going to be a total of 12 homework assignments within the course, but they've said that 2 of the lowest ones are droppable and will not be counted towards the learner's scores. So again, this is completely configurable by the course team, and then if they ask you to make changes, that's essentially what they would mean. The main thing to know is that these assignment types are applied at the subsection level. So for example, you can't have one subsection that's got in a unit homework assignments and also a quiz. The system will be very confused. You'll have to pick one or the other at the subsection level and say all of the assessment questions in here are either homework or they're a quiz. So what that means is course teams will often just keep their subsections that are graded completely independent of other content and definitely of other assessments too. So they might have a subsection called homework, perhaps halfway through a lesson, and then at the very end, they might have another subsection that's a quiz, and the quiz type content would go in that one. Much like the actual assessment questions, again, for the same reasons that I outlined, it is not a best practice to change the grading policy once the course has begun. Again, it's going to be very difficult to ensure fairness across all learners if basically the scoring changes and things are weighted differently, and it'll just be a lot to manage on the back end with the learners and being fair. So with that, I hope you are all set and ready to go in and make changes to the problem components as needed.